out a little more than I typically do. Here's what we're seeing today in this chapter. Elihu believes, and let me say correctly, that Job has questioned whether God is truly being just to him. Job has done that. Job has questioned God in his own situation. Job has stated that God is just and then said that God is treating him unjustly. He basically says God is just, but I'm not sure that he's being just to me. I've shared this before. Obviously, can't share a name, but I knew of a highly renowned evangelist um, here in our area who years ago told a friend of mine, they were talking about grace and they were talking about problems that come up in our lives. And this man told a friend of mine, I believe 100% in God's grace. I just wonder if it applies to me. You see, that is the height of hypocrisy. Oh, I believe God's grace is there for all. I'm just not sure it's there for me. Job says the exact same thing. Oh, I believe God is 100% just not with me. Okay? Now, let me say that in both examples, both Job and that person, there was a lot of things going on in their life. So, listen, we have to have a little bit of mercy on folks who sometimes talk in ways that they don't normally talk. Because I'm going to tell you, you have a point in your life where you can get hurt so bad that you'll say something you don't really mean. Listen, we as all of us, and you know, I want you to know, I don't know everything, but I do know this. There's never been two people who got married who one of them did not eventually say something they didn't really mean because of a situation that happened, okay? I mean, my wife's done it 100 times. Lord, forgive me for that. I hate to sound like Larry the Cable Guy. Forgive me, Lord. Here's the truth. We all have our own little breaking points. We don't really know where they are. Some people have had trouble and strife their whole lives. And, you know, it's like anything else. You start building up some tolerance, you know. I mean, if you just continue to go through something all the time, you eventually you're going to toughen up a little bit. You don't have any choice. You just have to. And you can see a person who maybe has their life has gone pretty simple and easy, and then the first time something really bad comes upon them, they're convinced that it's the end of the world. That's why you have to have some sympathy and some empathy on people. Do not ever tell anybody, now your situation is not that bad. Do not tell anybody that, because you don't know. I want you to know there are things you can tolerate that others can't, but I'm going to promise you there are things others can tolerate that you can't. And so one thing we need to always be is have grace and mercy, even when people begin to talk foolish like Job is. The problem Job's got, he's talking foolish, but his friends are not helping him at all. None of them. There in verse 13, Elihu gives us a giant, magnificent truth. Look at verse 13. He's speaking of God and says, who gave him charge over the earth, or who appointed him over the whole world? Well, listen, that's good preaching right there. His basic point is there is no one above God. There is no one who can assign God into his position. You know, the greatest question of all time maybe is, where did God come from? Except it's really a foolish statement, because God didn't come from anywhere. God has no beginning and God has no end. And listen, I want you to know, people have been arguing about that for centuries because we as believers can't answer the question. So be it. It is beyond our capability to even answer that question. We can say something, but we ourselves, it is not humanly possible for us to completely understand the idea that God has no beginning. I mean, that is a thought so big. You know, just think about this. We go to the book of Genesis and we read those words, in the beginning. And sometimes we fall into the idea that, okay, here comes the story of God. Do you realize that we have no way to measure how long God was before Genesis? Because there is no time to measure it with. There is no way for us to measure eternity, past or future. We write songs, doing our best. We write songs about, 10,000 years and then forevermore because, to us, 10,000 years is so long we can't even hardly think about that. And then when you figure that 10,000 years is like, it's not even the equivalent of a second when there is no time. This is too big for all of us, but Elihu makes a great point. There is no one above God. He's telling Job, how can you argue with someone who has no one above them? Here again, I want to give you some of my greatest country boy advice. When you come to something so big you can't understand it, y'all know what I say. Just believe it. Just believe it. Do not sit and beg God, I have to understand this before I can believe it, because you're never going to be able to humanly understand the idea of time not existing for God. God doesn't go by time. We do. Time is us, not Him. Just believe it. And you do this all the time already. How many of you in here today have ever seen a molecule or an atom? Think about this. This morning, the president of Russia says, I'm kind of making this veiled threat to shoot a bomb at somebody that works off atoms. And I'm going to tell you, if he had said this morning, I'm thinking about shooting a bomb into America that is made out of atoms, we would be fearful. And yet, we don't even know what an atom is in reality. We can read it in a book, but have you ever seen one? I know I haven't. And I know I have watched shows on how atomic weapons work. I've told y'all I like to watch all kinds of documentaries and history and things. Guess what? I'm still 100% clueless. And yet, I could have fear for a bomb that you tell me will blow me up from an atom, and I can't even prove there is an atom. I can prove that some scientists said there is. And yet, is there anybody here today who does not believe in atoms and molecules? No, we all do. And you have zero proof yourself. I am not opposed to science, but my problem with science sometimes is this. The only way I know science is true is to do what? Take some other person's word on it. I have never done an experiment to prove there is an atom, and yet I believe that they exist. You see, much of the time, we think we can't believe in all this God stuff because we can't understand it, and yet there's not a person in this room who questions whether or not an atomic weapon is real. And you've never seen one, never laid your hands on one, and my guess is you probably do not even know a single person in your life who has ever touched one. And yet we have no doubt. We believe them. And that is because men told us they exist, and we struggle with believing what God has told us is real. Verse number 14 and 15, Elihu there continues to share a truth with us and another big truth. Remember here, he's defending God as just. And here's what he says. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but you should. He says, if God were not just, then we wouldn't even be here today. Listen, by every divine right God has, He could have stopped us with Adam and Eve. Stopped us with Adam and Eve. He could have said, I had a plan. My plan is falling apart. So I'm just going to give up on it. Listen, I want you to know, if you had been God, I think you would have ended it right there. I think if you were as holy as God and you created these two people perfectly and gave them everything they could ever desire, and yet they sinned against you, you would have said, I'm done with this experiment. I'm done. He had every perfect right to simply end Adam and Eve and end us, but He didn't. I've looked many times and wondered a silly thing. I've wondered if God regrets not doing it. You know, it makes sense to say that, but here's the problem. There again, that doesn't make sense either, because God is without regret. Because you have to do something wrong to have regret. And when God did not destroy Adam and Eve, the reason He didn't is because of Jesus. Because He had a plan for His Son to come one day to hang upon a cross and die that man might be redeemed. And this was the plan put together before the foundations of the world, before, in the beginning of Genesis, before those words, there was a plan for Jesus Christ to die on a cross at Calvary. Now that's hard for us to grab. But there was no plan B. And plan B was not for God to go, well, Adam and Eve sinned. What do I do now? No. He had a plan. Because God is perfectly just, He did not alter His plan. If God were not just, He would have just given up on us and quit. You look on down into verses 16 through 19, and Elihu there is pointing out just how just God truly is. And he's giving the example there that God does not show partiality. But quite simply, God's not impressed with men's titles. God's not impressed with men's bank account. And God's not impressed with men who lack titles or lack a bank account. You know, in the world we live in today, here's the problem. People today, a lot of them have decided that all the rich are sin and the poor are good. I want you to know today that when it comes to being judged by Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter if you got all the money in the world or you have none. Many people today believe that the poor are somehow going to catch a break with God when it comes to the judgment of their souls. It does not matter today if you're a billionaire or if you owe $1 billion in debt. If you have not been saved, you're going to fall into judgment. The one thing the Bible does say is how much harder it is for a rich man to be saved. Why is that? Because rich men have a lot to rely on besides God. You look at these countries like Ukraine, you know why there are so many believers in many of those countries? Because they have had almost nothing for most of their lives, and the gospel sounds really good. You know, when you're struggling and you feel like your world... Listen, they live every day knowing that Russia could do this to them at any time. They've known it for a long, long time. And that often drives people to turn towards the Lord. But when a man sits in his house and has all the money in the world and his own personal security, what happens to him many times is he sits there and believes, I have this under control. Rich, poor, master, slave, black, red, yellow, white, it matters not. The reason God is truly just is because God shows no partiality to any race, no partiality to any class, no partiality to any social standing. That is why God is truly just. In verse 20 through 25 here, what we find is Elihu's theology starts to bleed out in his words. We've heard a lot of good stuff out of Elihu to here. 100% amen all the way. Here he begins to point out the justness of God by some more examples of God's impartial treatment, if you will, of sinners. Now, what he's saying here basically is that because there's no partiality with God, everyone gets what's coming to them. Now, obviously, because of where we are in this book, it is not too hard to understand what he means by that. You see, if I were to just say to you today, everybody gets what's coming to them, I can say that statement, and that is something that even people outside the church, for the most part, agree with. Because you know what? Those of us today who believe in the justice of God, those outside the church believe in karma. And karma is this idea that when you do bad things, just get ready. People say all the time, karma has a way of coming back around. And you know what? It don't work. It doesn't work. Do you understand that today, if you were to go, we have so many countries in the world today that I can't even keep up with the names of them anymore. I used to could look on a map and tell you that's the USSR. And today, it is split up into, Tajikistan, Dagestan, Baluchistan. I don't know what all they are. I just know there are little countries all over the place over there that I don't even know the names of anymore. And when you used to know the names of these places, every time a new government comes in, they change the name again. Do you know if I took you to all of those countries and could introduce you and I could meet myself, the leaders of every one of those countries, I am willing to say today that 98% of them got there through fraud and greed and walking right over the top of other people. I have appreciated the president of Ukraine who has said, I'm going to stay here and fight. And he has been lifted up to a heroic level in the last few days because he has done heroic things. But you know what we've all forgotten? Did you know this is the guy who is in the middle of the scandal of people over here being paid millions of dollars to run an energy company over there that this person did not even know anything about an energy company. Flat out bribery is basically what has been accused. This is the same guy, but when he grabs a gun and goes out and defends his nation, we make him into a hero. I want you to know I appreciate what he's doing right now, and he is acting heroically. My thing is, just make sure you don't ever pick you a living human being to be your hero, because you're picking somebody that you don't want for your hero. I don't care if it's the world's greatest warrior. I don't care if it's your granddad or your grandmother. There is one hero that will never let you down, and that is Jesus Christ. And he is the only one who is truly, will always do the right thing. It is clear here. His point is very simple. Everybody gets what's coming to them. What does that mean to Job? It means, Job, there's a reason why your skin is rotting off. There's a reason why your breath is so bad that when you walk down the street, children run from you. There's a reason your children are dead. There's a reason all your money's gone. Because everyone gets what's coming to them. Elihu here is building a very interesting idea. We've been in this, I've framed this whole book as a trial. We're getting fairly close to the end of this book now. It's hard to believe sometimes, but we are. And I framed this as a trial. And in a way, Elihu here is saying, God doesn't need a trial to find out what you are, Job. This whole trial has been a scam, and he was repeating something, those two words that I say all the time. he basically says, we don't have any need for this farce of a trial because he knows. His basic point is, we don't need a trial for Job because God already knows. I say those two words, he knows, all the time. I say them to people. I say them in my messages because I want to remind you and I want to remind myself that we may fool everyone else in the world, but we cannot fool him. Pretty simple. He says here, we really are wasting our time here. God knows Job is guilty. Now then when you get to verse 26 through 33, he begins here to make the point that when God chastens a man, should he ask that man how much chastening he needs? I got tickled when I thought about this because I don't know about your dads. Mine never one time asked me, how many licks do you need for me to get the message through? He just never did. But it reminded me of one of my greatest stupid things that I ever did in my entire life. I, as a ninth grade boy, was as full of myself as Elihu is. And I had a friend of mine, one of my best friends, who got in trouble in science class. And I decided to have, I was going to kind of show my teacher just how slick I was. And I raised my hand, and my teacher was Russell Palmer. He wound up being a friend of mine years later and lives over in Marsh County, and I would love it if he could hear me tell this story. But I raised my hand, and I said, Mr. Palmer, and he said, Mr. Collins, what can I do for you? I said, Matt, my good friend Matt Lovett, I said, he's one of my best friends. And because he's one of my best friends, I would like to volunteer to take half of his lick. And of course, y'all can imagine, me at the time, I'm pretty slick, man. This is good. Now, in Mr. Palmer's mind, he thought, oh, I got a lesson to teach this kid. He said, basically, Mr. Collins, that is impressive. I mean, you are a good friend. So he said, let's just go. We were, back then, if y'all remember, we'd try to get class in. You had to sit all the way through class knowing you're fixing to get burnt at the end of it because they had to go get a witness. He said, let's just go ahead and do it now. Let's get this over with. So he walked across the hall and he knocked on, I believe it was Miss Kathy's door, who was a teacher there, and told her, I need a witness. And he come in here and he said, Mr. Collins, I think since you volunteered, I'm going to give you the first half. He said, and I thought about it, and I thought, boy, you really do you really are harder when you get all the way through there, And I thought, yeah, okay. So he said, let's go out here. And so Miss Kathy was standing over there, and I know she's looking at this thinking, what in the world? And he said, now, Mr. Collins, did you have algebra this year? And I said, yes, sir. He said, in algebra, what does a half round off to? And I said, a whole. A whole. He said, that's right. Bend over. He absolutely torched me. Lit me on fire. I believe there was smoke coming off my blue jeans. I was sure of myself so much that I could pull this off. And I want you to know, I didn't do anything that dumb again, but I did a lot of dumb stuff. But what Elihu says here is, if God is going to discipline you, should he ask you how much you need? Because I know my dad never asked me, and I never had a teacher ask me, how many licks do you need, 1 or 3? I would have said 1. And I'm guessing, they would have said, no, I'm pretty sure you need 3. Because I gave you 3 yesterday and they didn't do any good either. His point here is that God chastises a person as much as they need, and a person shouldn't spend all their time complaining about being chastised. And in his mind, that's all Job is doing, is sitting around and complaining. Verse 34 through 37 to close us up this morning. Here, Elihu is clearly condemning Job as guilty when he says that Job's own words condemn him. And look in verse 37. He says something very interesting. He is speaking here of Job, and he says, "For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God." Here Elihu is speaking about Job and about Job's friends. And he's basically saying, Job's friends have said this, and now I say this. And the whole point goes down to this. Job is making his sins even worse by fighting back against God's discipline. And he said, there where it says, and he, how does it say it? Claps his hands among us. The idea Elihu is making there is the idea of arrogance. That Job is being arrogant. He basically accuses Job of hearing all of the evidence and just blowing it off. Just saying, I don't care about all your evidence. I'm innocent. You see, despite here in their mind, all four of these men's mind, despite all this mountain of evidence against Job, he refuses to admit his guilt. And he flippantly ignores his friends when they call on him to repent of his sins so that he can be restored to God. On top of all that, in Elihu's mind, Job's words have not only served to increase his guilt, Job has allowed his suffering to bring him into absolute rebellion against God. Now, let me say something to you. When we think of that, that sounds bad, right? The thought that Job has fallen into rebellion against God. It is bad. But I want to remind you something that we all need to remember. All sin is rebellion against God. I don't care how small the sin is. Do you know, go back to the idea of discipline, because I've joked around about it much because I grew up in the early 70s when your dads, for the most part, just pulled a belt off and lit you on fire. That's how you got disciplined. And when you went to school, your teachers did the exact same thing. I know some younger kids, it's beyond their imagination to think about one of their teachers whipping them. But as I've said before, my mother gave other parents permission to whip me. It's like if your kid gets in trouble while Jeff's at your house, just beat him too. Okay? And listen, most of us in here grew up that way. And listen, it didn't turn us all into horrible people. We learned a lot of good lessons. But what he's really saying here is, Job, you've fallen into rebellion. And here's the problem. Everything I ever got in trouble for in my life was rebellion against what? Rules. Rules. I mean, my parents, for example, they gave me rules around the house that said, thou shalt not do this, and you shall do this. And I didn't do the shalt nots, and I did do the, or maybe I'm getting that messed up, either way. I didn't do what they told me to do, and I did do what they told me not to do, because that's how foolish young people act many times. And the truth is, that's all fine and dandy when it's foolish 13-year-old country boys, but the real problem starts when we still act like that when we're 55. The truth is, every sin, no matter how small, is an act of rebellion against God because God hates sin. And there is not one sin in the Bible where it says, God says it's okay to do this one. So I don't care what sin you try to come up with. And how small it is in your mind, it is direct rebellion against God. And the simple truth is, biblically, the Bible's very clear that you're either for God or you're against God. You're either a member of God's army or you're actively fighting against Him. The Bible says there are no fence setters. You can't sit on a fence. The Bible absolutely condemns being lukewarm. Jesus Himself said, "Those who are lukewarm, I will spew out of my mouth." Jesus' words, straight in red letters. Today, God is calling someone to be saved. I don't know who it is. If I did, I'd walk right back there and talk to you face to face. I'd let everybody else go and we'd sit down. But God is calling someone in this congregation. I have no doubt about it. I believe that every week. If I didn't, I couldn't keep going. But I believe it every week. He's calling somebody today to get off the fence, to be saved, and to jump into the fray. You know, right now you look at Ukraine. Just outside of the borders of Ukraine are two countries that you're very familiar with. Sweden and Finland. If I mention those names to you, what's one of the first things you think of? These are, listen, there ain't any other way for me to put it. These are the two most vanilla countries in the whole world. And now listen, I like vanilla ice cream, okay? But I don't like it as much as I do with some chocolate on it or some strawberries in it. Here's what I mean. These are two countries that have spent the last 100+ years just saying, well, we're not on this side and we're not on this side. We're not opposed to you. We're not with you. And every time trouble comes, you know what they do? They just sit there. Why does that trouble me so bad? Because if Putin moves in, you know what they're going to do? Hey, United States, come bail us out of this. We don't fight, but you come and fight for us. In World War II, it's exactly what they did. They just said, well, if we don't get involved in any way, we won't get all of our buildings burned. You know what? It worked. They sat back and ignored the slaughter of Jews, and they didn't take any part in anything for the most part. They're determined to be neutral at all times because it's really good for self-preservation. It's very aggravating to watch them just sit back and sit out. They believe if we stay neutral, war will never come. Our world is filled with people right now who believe if I stay neutral, war is not going to come to me. I'm going to ask Tiffany if she would to come and play. Listen, that is a lie. It's a myth. You're going to battle when it comes to the war that's going on around you spiritually. You are a warrior in that battle today. You are not neutral, friend. You know, we grow up in West Kentucky, and it's pretty simple. You grow up in West Kentucky, for the most part, you don't have a hatred of church. You don't have a hatred of God because you grow up and your grandparents are Christians, and it doesn't really matter how you feel. You don't hate church, and you know, most people in West Kentucky, they go to church sometime or another. They go for, you know, Easter or Christmas, or if they have a niece, you know, there's tons of people who hadn't been to church in 2 years, but if their niece gets baptized, guess what they do? They go to church. You know why? They don't hate church, not in their mind. They don't hate God, not in their mind. They're Finland and Sweden. We'll just sit it out. And in the end, if I just stay neutral, you know, nothing's really going to come out of this. And that's a myth because the Bible says today you are in a battle. And you are either fighting for God or you are fighting against Him. Those very people I just mentioned, if I were to ask them, they would tell you, no, I am not on the devil's side. Of course not. Yet they are. I remember watching an interview here a while back with a rock band. And this rock band back in the 80s, They used satanic symbols and stuff. And that's because young boys thought all that kind of stuff was cool, you know. And in their mind, they were never Satan worshipers. They acted like Satan worshipers because young boys thought that was cool, you know. I mean, it's just the way it is, okay? And this is a band that I bought their albums when I was a kid. Because young boys they just want rebellion and, you know, with just all that. So anyway, they were literally interviewing him, and the guy admitted, one of their lead, I don't remember if it's the lead singer now, which one it was, he said, "No, man, we don't even believe in the devil. We don't really believe in God either. We were just looking to make money." Now, you see, what they were saying was, we didn't really care how it looked, but in reality is, we're totally neutral here. You see, they don't want to lose any, quote, Christians that might listen to their music. And at the same time, they don't care if they look a little bit devilish to the young boys that are attracted to that kind of stuff. They're basically said, "No, we're Finland, man. We just want to have rock and roll and have a good time and just girls and money and, you know, and party. Have nothing to do with Jesus, didn't have nothing to do with Satan." What they do not understand is they're wrong. They are serving Satan. Because if you're not serving Christ, you're serving Satan. Most people cannot grasp that idea. If you're here today and you've never been saved, you're in the devil's party. You're on the same side the devil is. I know you don't see it that way, but the Bible does. Well, I've never met a person yet in my own personal life who felt like they were serving the devil. And I really believe that if you were able to admit it to yourself today, that you would come down this aisle today and ask to be saved, because I don't think you want to serve the devil, but you are. There is no fence with God. God tore the fence down at Calvary. That fence is gone. You are either with him or against him. I do not know the answer for you today, but I'm going to ask everyone here to bow their head. And if you are here today and you don't know which side you're on, then I encourage you to come today. And we can sit down and talk. And listen, we don't have to do it right here. We'll find us a room. We'll stay here as long as we need to. But you can't sit out this war like Finland and Sweden always tries to do over in Europe. War is going to come to you sooner or later. Because I don't know how long you're going to live on this earth, but when you pass this earth, if you pass without Jesus, you are going to be thrown into a war that you don't even want to imagine, because it's one for all of eternity, of which you have no hope of ever escaping. If you need to come, you come right now. Amen. Amen. I appreciate all of you being here today. Thank you, Tiffany and Sean, for being able to get the Facebook going over there on that. I know we've had internet troubles all week. It's crazy sometimes what you can do on your little phone that you can't manage to pull off sometimes on your big computers, okay? That's just the way it is, but I appreciate those who joined us, and I appreciate all of you today. I'm going to ask Tommy Alcock if he would this morning to dismiss us. We'll be back again tonight at 5. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I hope I get to see you tonight.